Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Noah Church, and I've been invited this week to give the Rap Week webinar for the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. I'm just going to wait a few moments for everyone who'd like to join to get in, and then I'll start the presentation. And this week, I'm going to be chatting about pornography. I have become something of an expert on the effects of pornography on the human brain in the long term. And I've been invited here because I spoke at the conference in Houston, the Coalition to End Sexual Exploitation Summit that was held there last month. And I'll be giving the same presentation here. So I'll go ahead and start now. I believe it's 3 p.m. Eastern time. I'm here on the West Coast in Portland, Oregon. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the White Ribbon Against Pornography Week webinar series. This is sponsored by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. The National Center on Sexual Exploitation works to address the public health crisis of pornography in addition to exposing the links between all forms of sexual exploitation. Now, the center is a national sponsor of White Ribbon Against Pornography Week, which is an annual national week of public awareness and education about the harms of pornography. Now, to learn more, you can visit endsexualexploitation.org. My name is Noah Church, and like I said, I've been invited here to give a presentation on the effects long-term and neurologically of pornography on the human brain. Now, I'm 27 years old, which means that I was among the first generation of people to grow up with easy access to the internet in their homes. And I started using pornography when I was about 9 years old. And I'm not going to go too far into my own story today, but suffice to say, it became a habit, a frequent habit for me, and an addiction for the next 15 years of my life. And it wasn't until I was 24 years old that, it wasn't until I was 24 years old that I realized how damaging it had been to my life and decided to quit. And that experience was so transformative for me that I wanted to share that information with other people. I wanted to help other people learn what they needed to learn to make that choice for themselves. So I wrote a book called Wack, Addicted to Internet Porn, and started speaking. So I'm going to start screen sharing now, which means you won't see my face anymore. You'll see my presentation. This is my first live webinar, so forgive any blumbering. Screen share, full screen. Present to everyone. Okay, there's me, there's my book, there's my website if you'd like to learn more. Now, during this presentation, I want to present in a way that you'll find out why by 2011, a preponderance of studies were showing that 14 to 28% of young men under 40 years old were struggling with erectile dysfunction with their partners. Whereas in 2002, just 9 years earlier, studies were showing us that that number was 2% of young men under 40. Now, what changed in those 9 years so drastically to so dramatically increase the rates of sexual dysfunction in young men? Well, in 2006, we started to see YouTube-style streaming porn sites go live on the internet, which meant that it was much easier for the public to access an unlimited supply of free streaming content, hardcore pornographic content, at the click of a mouse. Now, here are some symptoms and conditions that we see in people who use internet porn consistently over years. And these are symptoms that we see remit or disappear once they remove that one variable of internet porn from their lives. And the first is chronic erectile dysfunction. And I suffered with this myself. And this is not the type of ED that we're used to seeing. It's not a venous or an arterial problem. It is a neurological problem. And most often guys with porn-induced erectile dysfunction, they still are able to perform for pornography and masturbation, but when they actually go to have real intimate encounters with a person they actually care about, it just doesn't work. And there's also anorgasmia or delayed ejaculation, which means that it's very difficult or impossible to reach orgasm with a partner. Brain fog and concentration problems. lethargy, a lack of motivation, social anxiety and a lack of confidence, depression, emotional numbness, declining interest in real partners, and an escalation to types of pornographic content that don't match one's original tastes or even their sexual orientation. Now, you might be wondering, how can simply using pornography cause all of these symptoms? Well, it's because long-term use can physically and chemically alter our brains. Now, here is a representation of several structures in the center of the brain that make up the reward circuit. These structures are evolutionarily ancient and they're shared among mammals, so we can see similar things happening in other creatures like lab rats. Now, these structures primarily drive us toward things that are pleasurable and away from things that are painful. Here's a simpler representation of that reward circuit in a cross-section of the human brain. Now, these structures govern our mood, our emotions, our desires. It's where our drive and our motivation comes from. It's where we fall into and out of love, and it's where addiction happens. These structures impel us toward beneficial activities like eating good food, bonding with others, achievement, taking risks, play, sex, and novelty. Interestingly, we're wired to be inquisitive and curious for many reasons, so that we can find things like new territories and new food sources, and of course, novel mates. Dopamine, you've probably heard of it, is the neurochemical that largely powers this reward circuit. We see something desirable, it gives us a release of dopamine in the reward circuit that tells us, I've got to have that, whatever that thing is, whether it's the next potato chip or a cool drink on a hot day, an attractive coworker, or the next video clip on a streaming porn site. Now, it's important to recognize that dopamine is associated with wanting and seeking and craving, not so much with pleasure, satisfaction. It's other neurochemicals like endogenous opioids or endocannabinoids that are released after something satisfying that make us feel that satisfaction, so we stop our seeking and craving. But the kicker is that the dopamine system is stronger than the opioid system, which means that evolutionarily speaking, it's just more advantageous for us to be seeking and doing things than just sitting around in a satisfied stupor. This is why even after, say, we've had a big meal and we declare that we're full, we can still order that dessert when we see how delicious it looks, because can override those feelings of satisfaction. Now, this experiment demonstrates the power of dopamine. If we hook up an electrode to the reward circuit of a rat's brain and allow him to activate that reward circuit, he will do so, pressing that lever, ignoring all other stimuli like good food or receptive mates, just to press that lever, not because it feels good necessarily, but because it makes him feel like he is just about to accomplish something really important, like eating some cheese or having some sex, even though he's not actually doing anything that's beneficial to him in any way. His brain is being tricked into believing it's about to accomplish something valuable, not too dissimilar from what internet pornography does to us. Now, on the other hand, if researchers block dopamine, a rat loses all motivation to do pretty much anything. If we place food in his mouth, he will chew it and swallow, but if the food is across the room, for example, he just won't have the motivation to go and get it, and he will literally die of laziness. And all natural rewards are important. Things like eating and bonding with others are vital, but biologically speaking, nothing is more important than passing on our genes to the next generation. So sexual stimuli produce the highest dopamine spike of any natural reward. Now, what about unnatural rewards like hard drugs? Well, morphine produces about the same dopamine spike as sexual stimuli, whereas cocaine sends dopamine skyrocketing to over 300% of baseline. Now, these drugs are addictive and they work the way they do only because they hijack circuits and mechanisms that have evolved to impel us toward natural rewards, good things that are evolutionarily advantageous. And they can make us feel like we're doing something great, even though we're not actually doing anything beneficial to ourselves or our communities or our families. Internet porn can be used in the same way. A lot of users can keep dopamine levels elevated for hours by constantly clicking to new content, new videos, even overriding feelings of satisfaction from orgasm by clicking to something even more arousing because of the unlimited supply of internet porn. Now, this works because of something known as the Coolidge Effect. Now, to demonstrate the Coolidge Effect, if we have a male rat and a willing female rat in the same cage, at first we'll see a frenzy of copulation as the male struggles to fertilize her. Over time, however, even if she is still into it, he will start to lose interest. But if you place a fresh female into the cage, the male rat will have a burst of fresh enthusiasm and struggle once more to fertilize this new female. Now, you can repeat this process as many times as you like until the male rat collapses from exhaustion. Now, what's actually happening in the male rat's brain is the first female stimulates a large dopamine release, which tells him, man, I want her. But over time, with each successive sexual encounter, she produces less and less dopamine in his reward circuit. But he sees a new female and he gets a shot of dopamine almost as high as that first encounter with the first female. And this mechanism helps to ensure genetic diversity and to ensure that no fertile female goes unfertilized. Now, what about humans, though? Does this really relate to our own experience? Well, this study is of Australian men, and you can see that their subjective arousal and their penile circumference was measured over time as they watched pornography. Now, for the first 16 trials there, you can see that they were watching the same pornography. But as soon as they were introduced to fresh material, both their subjective arousal and their penile circumference shot way up. Now, this drive for novelty isn't just for new mates, but also for new settings, new genres, new scenarios, etc. The modern sexual environment for many people is to go online, open up 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 tabs, and search for that perfect video clip to orgasm to. Perhaps seeing dozens or even hundreds of attractive mates in just one sitting, all performing a lifetime's variety of sex acts. Now compare that to the sexual environment that humanity evolved in, that our ancestors lived in for thousands of generations. Compared to that, internet porn is an explosion of stimulation that our brains simply did not evolve to handle. Internet porn is what's known as a supernormal stimulus, which is an exaggerated version of a normal stimulus that amplifies qualities we find especially compelling. Other examples of supernormal stimuli are things like modern-day junk food, which contains fats and sugars and salts in higher quantities than found in naturally occurring foods. Gambling machines, which are literally designed to hook us and be addictive. And video games, which might make us feel like we're accomplishing something important, like saving the world, but we're not actually doing anything beneficial to ourselves or others. Animals, too, can be vulnerable to supernormal stimuli. We can see that shorebirds, for example, will abandon their real eggs in favor of larger, more colorful, fake plaster eggs crafted by researchers. And the male jewel beetle will happily copulate with a brown beer bottle, because to him, this beer bottle looks like the most beautiful, biggest, most bodacious female he has ever seen. And he's just responding to an evolutionary cue that has been advantageous for him and his ancestors for thousands of generations. But now in the modern day world, when exposed to a supernormal stimulus, it's leading them literally into a dead end. Now, you probably know where I'm going with this. All the creatures on this slide are just reacting to what they've evolved to react to. But is copulating with a computer screen really all that different from copulating with a beer bottle? I don't think so. Now, what is addiction? It's important to talk about this because there are varying definitions. I go by the American Society of Addiction Medicine's definition. And their short definition says that addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. This means that addiction is a singular disorder no matter what the object of that addiction is, whether it's a substance like alcohol or cocaine, or behavior like gambling or sex or porn. All addictions are characterized by the inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, craving, diminished recognition of one's own behavioral problems, and a dysfunctional emotional response. All addictions also cause very similar brain changes that are observable across these types of addictions. These include things like sensitization, desensitization, hypofrontality, and an altered stress response. And we're going to go over these one by one because it's really important to understand. Sensitization, or sexual conditioning, really in the case of internet porn, is the brain's process of wiring itself to stimuli that in the past have been rewarding. Dopamine is released and it tells our brains this activity is really valuable. You should do it again and again. Dopamine tells our brain to wire itself to react more strongly in the future to the stimuli that created this pleasure response. Now, in a natural human-to-human sexual relationship, we might become conditioned or sensitized to the cues that usually lead to sex. The sound of a lover's voice or the scent of their hair might be cues that lead to an arousal response. But when people condition themselves instead for internet porn, they condition themselves to the cues that lead to sexual release in that scenario. Things like being at home alone with the computer, opening up a private browser window, seeing something sexual in a sidebar, etc. And these cues can lead to powerful cravings. Here's one guy's experience. Relapsed porn once, and even though I didn't get fully erect, I could not believe the intensity of the rush I got when I clicked to the site. Very powerful excitation, tingling, dry mouth, and even trembling. Now, here are two brain studies on porn addicts that came out of Cambridge University. Here at Cambridge, they compared two groups of people, healthy controls and people who identified as compulsive users of pornography. They exposed them to images of pornography and measured their brain response. Now, you can see in the healthy volunteers, their reward circuit is responding to what they're seeing. They're interested. But the compulsive pornography users, their reward circuit lights up to a much greater degree, which subjectively means that these people are experiencing greater desire and craving when exposed to these cues. Now, this sensitization process in the brain looks just the same as it does with drug addiction. The researchers at Cambridge also noted that the compulsive users might have wanted it more, but they didn't necessarily like it anymore and were never really satisfied with what they were using or seeing. Now, this happens because of a concept and a principle called neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to change and grow and reform as we age and go through life. New pathways are created when we learn new skills, like a new language or learning to juggle, and old pathways that we don't use anymore are weakened. This process is known as rewiring. Now, these pathways are also competitive. So let's visualize two pathways for sexual release here. One for internet porn and one for real intimacy with real people. As one uses more porn, that pathway becomes stronger and more deeply ingrained, and the pathway for real sex becomes weaker. Over enough time, with enough porn usage, the real person pathway can become weak enough to be dysfunctional, which can result in sexual dysfunctions like porn-induced erectile dysfunction or delayed ejaculation. Now, the good news is that this process is reversible. The brain can change itself. So all we need to do is quit using porn and start having more of those real intimate experiences, and we can weaken the porn pathway and strengthen the real people pathway and recover from these dysfunctions. Now, 60% of those subjects that the Cambridge University researchers studied who were compulsive users had porn-induced ED or low libido with real partners. Now, the second brain change that I want to talk about is desensitization. Now, we're sensitized to the stimuli that we're addicted to, but at the same time, we're desensitized to everything else. This is why in an addict's life, the addiction becomes the only thing that's really exciting. And everything else, like homework or friendships, just becomes a little bit less interesting because they're desensitized. Now, to understand how this happens, let's look a little bit closer at how neurons communicate. So we have a sending neuron that's sending a message and a receiving neuron that's receiving it. The sending neuron releases a chemical signal. Let's say it's dopamine. The receiving neuron has receptors that receive this signal. Think of these like ears that are hearing a message. Now, the strength of this message depends on the amount of dopamine available to be released, the amount of receptors available to hear that message, and the amount of connections between neurons. And a decline in any one of these three factors leads to a weaker message. Now, what happens when we overstimulate these neural connections? Well, what do we do when someone shouts at us for a sustained period of time? We cover our ears. And that's basically what our neurons do. The number of receptors available to receive the message is reduced, as is the amount of dopamine available to send the message. The system is protecting itself from overstimulation by desensitizing. There's a decline in dopamine and dopamine receptors, and the same process can occur with other neurochemicals. Now, over a long period of time, we can see a third type of desensitization happening, which is a decline in the actual amount of connections between neurons, which leads to an observable loss of gray matter in the reward center, which is exactly what this study out of the Max Planck Institute found in porn users. Now, they didn't have two separate groups of healthy controls and compulsive users. They just related the amount of porn people watched each week and the number of years they'd been consuming with what they were seeing in their brain scans. And what they found was that the more use per week and the more years someone had been viewing porn correlated with a reduction in gray matter in the reward circuit, particularly in the right caudate nucleus, which is a part of the reward circuit. Now, the lead author, Simone Kuhn, said about this, that could mean that regular consumption of pornography more or less wears out your reward system. Now, what this means isn't just that we're desensitized to what we're using. It means that we're desensitized to everything. The reward circuitry, as I stated before, governs a wide array of motivations and drives within our life. So when it's desensitized, we become desensitized to all stimulation within our daily lives. We also see tolerance, which is a desensitization of our own use to that addictive chemical or substance or behavior. And it presents as needing a higher dose when someone is using drugs, for example, or more stimulation or a greater duration of stimulation in a porn user to achieve that same feeling of pleasure. So a porn user might take a lot longer to find that perfect clip, or they might escalate to new categories, new genres that are more extreme and shocking and surprising, because paired with arousal, these powerful emotions can send arousal to new heights. And a lot of these people who use porn over years consistently need to be looking at more extreme content just to feel aroused anymore because they're that desensitized. This can lead to an escalation to new fetishes or new genres that they're interested in that they weren't interested in when they first started using porn or exploring their sexuality. Now, how do we know if these fetishes are porn-induced or if they were innate? Well, remove the porn, and the porn-induced fetish or interest will gradually disappear. Now, the third brain change that I'd like to talk about is hypofrontality. And this brain change was also found in that Max Planck study that I talked about. Hypo means below normal or deficient, and frontal refers to the frontal lobes and the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Now, this area of the brain is largely what makes us special among the animal kingdom. It's where a lot of our higher order thoughts happen. It's where we can reflect and judge ourselves and our situation. It's where we can make plans and pay attention, anticipate consequences, and importantly, regulate our mood and control our impulses. The hypofrontality is a weakened connection between these frontal lobes and the reward circuit. And that study found the nerve connections between the reward circuit and the prefrontal cortex indeed worsened with increased porn watching. Here's a quote from the study. Dysfunction of this circuitry has been related to inappropriate behavioral choices, such as drug seeking, regardless of the potential negative outcome. That fourth brain change is an altered stress response. Now, addiction changes the brain in a wide variety of ways. We've only had time to really touch on the surface of it today. But simply put, stress activates the reward circuit. And when we have an ingrained pathway branching out from the reward circuit to a behavior or an addictive substance, that is what our brain relies on to make itself feel better when the reward circuit is activated. So a stressful situation or anxiety or the stress of withdrawal after one quits can lead to greater cravings. Now, this is what causes a lot of the withdrawal symptoms that people experience when they're quitting a behavior like this, like internet porn use, like headaches, mood swings, and great cravings. So what are we left with here? Well, we're left with a brain that's desensitized, and that desensitization is telling us, I just can't get no satisfaction. But the sensitized part of us is calling out, hey, I've got just what you need. Our hypofrontality is saying, I know that's a bad idea, but I just can't stop you. And those dysfunctional stress circuits are just screaming for something to take the edge off right now. So I'd like to go over a little bit of what we just talked about. Addiction, like I said, it's a primary disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. And all addictions fall into these same patterns. They're characterized by many of the same symptoms and they result in many of the same brain changes. There are over 170 internet addiction brain studies, all backing up what I've just talked about in this presentation, including over 25 brain studies, in particularly focusing on porn use. One doesn't have to actually be addicted to experience porn-induced brain changes and symptoms. For example, I work with a lot of guys who are trying to recover from porn-induced sexual dysfunctions. And many of them, once they realize that porn is the problem, they can quit and they don't suffer through great cravings or relapse. And they can recognize that this is a problem and quit without much problem, which means they're probably not addicted, but they still develop porn-induced erectile dysfunction or another sexual dysfunction. Quitting porn use can, over time, reverse many of these changes and cause symptoms to remit. Women also can and often do develop many of the same unhealthy porn use behaviors and symptoms. They obviously won't develop erectile dysfunction, but many of them develop an inability to maintain arousal with a partner or reach orgasm during partnered sex without pornography. Now, if you'd like to look at a more thorough review of this research, recently this article came out, Is Internet Pornography Causing Sexual Dysfunctions? A Review with Clinical Reports. I advise you to go look that up, get a lot more details on all these factors. Now, I wasn't the first one to collate all this information. A lot of these slides were adapted from yourbrainonporn.com, run by Gary Wilson and Marnia Robinson. And this is their book, Your Brain on Porn. I highly recommend it. It's a great read. And from my own work, you can go to addictedtointernetporn.com, and my book is Wack, Addicted to Internet Porn. This has been a seminar for the White Ribbon Against Pornography Week put on by the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. It's been a pleasure presenting for you all today, and I hope I get to do it again sometime. Have a lovely day. Adios.